beautiful day, a long time ago. The sun shone brightly overhead, and the sand partridges flitted about in the fields just outside of Jerusalem.
2 young men on a journey. They're followers of a man whose name had reached Jerusalem long before they had. Disciples of a man named Jesus, whose teachings have stirred up excitement all over Galilee.
And while the citizens of Jerusalem await the arrival of Jesus, these 2 disciples do their very best to coax a stubborn donkey to follow them.
You see, Jesus had sent them. For the donkey, a quiet, a simple creature, a symbol of peace, a symbol of humility.
But Jerusalem was far from peaceful as Jesus and his disciples approached the town.
There was an air of anticipation as men and women, young and old, left their homes to line the streets in the hopes of catching a glimpse of the man who was said to perform miracles.
A man who could turn water into wine.
A man who could heal the blind and deaf.
A man who could even bring someone back from the dead.
They removed their cloaks and laid them down on the streets.
They cut branches from the nearby palm trees and waved them in the air as Jesus passed by them.
Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.
It was a joyous day, filled with much celebration. Finally, this great man they'd been hearing about, a man who many had claimed was the Messiah, had come to Jerusalem.
But you see, not everyone in Jerusalem was very happy to have Jesus in their midst.
The local Pharisees were concerned. This could be a problem.
They didn't like how Jesus was exciting the crowds. They worried about his power and influence over the people of Jerusalem.
So in secret, they met with one of his disciples, Judas, to discuss how they might be able to get rid of their little problem.
Together, Judas and the Pharisees worked out a plan for Judas to betray Jesus. He would lead the Pharisees and soldiers to Jesus and would confirm his identity with just a single kiss.
And for this help, Judas was paid the sum of 30 pieces of silver.
A worthy sum to receive for one little kiss.
Or was it?
A few nights later, on Passover, Jesus gathered with his disciples in an upper room of a home in Jerusalem.
Shortly after the meal had began, Jesus did the unthinkable. He removed his outer clothes. He took a towel and tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a wash basin.
And then he began to wash his disciples' feet.
Jesus? Washing the feet of the men who followed him?
Lord, are you going to wash my feet?
You do not understand these things that I'm doing now, but you will understand after these things.
You see, Peter was upset. How could Jesus, his teacher, his Messiah, his friend, lower himself to wash Peter's feet? It was Peter who should be washing Jesus' feet.
You call me teacher and Lord, and you do so correctly, for this is what I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example. You should do just as I have done for you.
And in that moment, Jesus' disciples understood. Jesus wanted them to humble themselves before others, to pass along a message of love from God above.
But what they did not yet understand was that this night was far from over.
Now, it was time for the Passover feast, and Jesus and his disciples ate and drank.
They talked and laughed together,
They relaxed and refreshed,
not realizing what really lay ahead.
never knowing the true significance of this night.
And then Jesus stood and picked up the bread.
The disciples stopped their chatter and turned to their teacher.
Jesus gave thanks over the bread, broke it, and gave it to his disciples.
Take and eat. This is my body.
After they had finished, he took up a cup and gave thanks and gave it to his disciples as well.
Drink from it, all of you. This is my blood, the blood of the covenant that has been spilled for many, for the forgiveness of sins.
A simple supper of bread and wine. But did they understand, the disciples, that the meal they had just shared was so much more than bread and wine? It was goodbye.
Later that night, in a nearby garden, Gethsemane, a place filled with beauty, a place of calm and quiet.
Jesus brought his disciples there in the hopes of finding some peace from the sorrow of what he knew was coming.
He wanted his friends by his side. He needed them to keep watch while he prayed to his Father.
My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me.
But as he looked back, he found that his disciples had fallen asleep. They were asleep at a time like this, with death on his doorstep. How could they?
Men, could you not keep watch with me for 1 hour?
But the disciples could not comprehend what was in store for their teacher and friend. And so, once more, sleep overtook them.
My Father, if it is not possible for this cup to pass from me without me drinking from it, your will be done.
As before, Jesus found he had been forsaken by those he trusted most. Only this time, it was too late.
Judas,
Here to carry out the plan devised by the Pharisees,
to keep his promise.
to fulfill his destiny.
And as the other disciples began to stir, Judas did what he came to do.
A single kiss.
That's all it took.
The Pharisees had their man.
And Judas had his 30 pieces of silver.
Then, in the early morning hours, the sun just barely breaking above the horizon, the governor, Pontius Pilate, reflected on the case that he must judge that day.
A man who many had wondered if he was their long-awaited Messiah, and king, the king of the Jews. But the Pharisees were fearful
They said he was dangerous,
that he would unite the people against Rome.
that he would even overthrow the government.
But had he actually committed the crimes for which he was accused?
Was this Jesus guilty, or was he innocent? But the Pharisees would not be deterred. The wheels were already turning. The plan was in motion.
The soldiers brought Jesus to stand trial before Pilate, and as he stood there, looking at the prisoner, this so-called dangerous criminal, Pilate saw a man, a humble man, nothing menacing about him.
Are you the king of the Jews?
You say so.
But as the Pharisees hurled their accusations against him, Jesus said nothing.
Don't you hear the charges they are bringing against you?
Jesus remained silent. What could Pilate do if the prisoner didn't even speak up or defend itself? Didn't he know how serious the charges were? Didn't he know Pilate held his very life in his hands?
Who should I release to you? This poor, humble man before me, or Barabbas?
Barabbas!
Once more, Pilate gave his decision to the people.
Then what should I do with Jesus, who is called the Christ?
Crucify him!
And though Pilate could find no crime, no wrongdoing committed by the quiet, calm man before him, he gave in to the cries of the crowd and sentenced Jesus to death.
I am innocent of this man's blood. You take care of it yourselves.
During the next following hours, Jesus endured great pain.
He was beaten and mocked.
He was spat at and scorned.
On his back, the guards placed a kingly robe, and on his head they laid a crown of thorns.
Hail, King of the Jews.
And just at that moment, when Jesus could take no more, they led him to the cross.
The cross on which he would be crucified.
There, high on the hilltop, in a place known as Golgotha, the soldiers nailed Jesus to the cross, one in each hand.
And one in the feet. As they raised the cross, those closest to Jesus came to be by his side.
Mary Magdalene, an ardent follower and friend. John,
his disciple, the one he called beloved.
and Mary, his mother.
They stand guard as Jesus endures what he must.
The ridicule of the soldiers,
The agony of a painful death.
and then
As darkness came over the land,
Jesus looked to the sky, to his Father, and knew the time had come.
It is finished.
Three days later,
Another garden.
Jesus' body had been buried in a nearby tomb with a large stone rolled in front of the entrance.
It was early Sunday morning, and the world seemed sad.
Suddenly, the ground shook violently.
The earthquake, the light of the angels was so great that the soldiers fell to the ground as if they were dead.
But someone else wasn't dead anymore.
Jesus had beaten death.
You see, no more would sin have a grip on earth. Jesus, through his glory and the power of his Father, have risen from the dead.
Later that day, Mary Magdalene arrived to anoint Jesus' body and was shocked by what she found.
Mary was inconsolable. She didn't understand. Where was Jesus' body?
Woman, why are you weeping? They have taken my Lord away. I don't know where they have put him.
And then Jesus, who only days before had been put to death on the cross, appeared, no longer dead, but alive once more.
Mary,
And in that moment, Mary knew the promises Jesus had made to us all were true.
He is the Messiah. the Son of God, sent here on earth to sacrifice himself for the forgiveness of sins.
And on this day, we all can rejoice because Jesus is alive.
Amen.
He